Okay. Welcome to Zoom to Gettysburg, everybody. Zoom is designed as a friendly informational discussion with LBGs, historians, authors, and guests. Program leaders and moderators require polite, courteous behavior. LBGs and presenters will make every effort to provide accurate historical information. However, the information provided and group discussion may be subject to different interpretations among all participants. Information shared herein does not guarantee passing and or successful completion of any test, exam, class, and or course, including but not limited to the NPS Licensed Battlefield Guide Test. Moderators reserve the right to limit discussion and comments during the program. Zoom programs are recorded but not published at this time. By attending, you give your permission to be recorded and potentially published in the future. So we have a very special guest tonight. Troy Harman has been a National Park Service Ranger since 1984. This is 40 years for him as a ranger, 35 years here at Gettysburg, including stints at Appomattox, Courthouse National Historic Park, Mammoth Cave, Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania, Independence National Historical Park, but he has been our treasure since 1989 here at Gettysburg. He's one of our more popular rangers, with a devoted following on Pennsylvania Cable Network. You can always tell when Troy's on the field because we can't get around all the cars that park everywhere, and it's a real pleasure to have him here tonight to talk about his new book, All Roads Led to Gettysburg. So Troy, I'm going to let you get in, and once you're in and we see you're going, I'm going to go blank and just listen. And welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Fran. And my son is helping here in the background. He's going to set up my slides now for me. It shouldn't take but a second. So just a quick technical, and I think people can hear me now, can't they?
Yes.
Okay. And so I'll just say, as he's helping me bring up the slides,
right,
that it's a really it's such an honor to be able to speak to the guides, and because you're speaking to the brain trust of the park.
Huh.
And I have the good fortune over the years of several times you all asking me to speak. At one time, would have been in 2000, about 2001, I got a chance to speak to you all at the GAR building. And you met there, and it was I don't say this as trying to point any sort of kudos to me, but that night it was packed, the balcony was packed. I remember all those beautiful paintings on the wall, and that's a treasured memory. Another time, you all invited me to do a frozen finger tour.
Yes, I was on that, not as a guide.
Oh my gosh, that was cold. We were cracking ice under our feet.
Yep.
So
I do remember
that. So anyway, tonight I'm speaking on. Can you see the slides? Okay, do they come up?
We can see the slides. It looks like you have 20 slides ready to go.
Okay, excellent.
And then somehow, if you can turn it to slideshow, it'll fill the whole screen.
Can we turn it to slideshow to fill the whole screen?
No, that's what wasn't loading.
Okay, that part didn't load, so
this is fine. Okay. Good luck. Break a leg, but don't.
Okay, all right. Now the premise of All Roads Led to Gettysburg is the primary argument is that the battle wasn't an accident where it occurred. You know, for years you had the shoe story, and that was debunked a long time ago. But the problem is, after it was debunked, thoroughly debunked, there wasn't a shoe factory in it. Why would armies march all the way from Virginia into Maryland and Pennsylvania just to get shoes? And everyone knew there was something not quite right about that. And when after it was debunked thoroughly, and we congratulated ourselves we had debunked it, then there was nothing to fill the void. So why were the armies there? If they weren't there for shoes, okay, so we do away with the shoe story. So why were they there? How did they end up there? And so over time, the story that developed was it was a meeting engagement. That is, they just sort of ran into each other, and it was sort of a show up and shoot thing. And oh, there they are, let's get them. And that doesn't make a lot of sense either if you study how the generals thought and where they went to school, West Point. You read their reports, and they didn't fly by the seat of their pants like that. There was a training, there was a protocol, and there were many different ways to find out where your enemy is, not just through intelligence, but just through the environment. You could you could presume that your enemy is going to follow certain routes based on water, rail, and road. And so that's the argument, is I argue that it wasn't an accidental meeting engagement at Gettysburg, but rather something rather predictable months before it happened. And that Gettysburg was a natural location for the two armies to meet. And that both armies would have had, there would have been a mystery about how many numbers were in front of them at any given point. If you advance on a certain road, you might run into a force that's larger than you. But outside of that, the armies had a pretty good idea where the other was based on water, rail, and road. And the whole book revolves on water, rail, and road as being fully operational. Let's say you have a house, or you're going to build a house. You won't build a house without septic, electricity, and water. You just simply don't build a house there. And if you have a family, you want good schools nearby, maybe a police department, a fire department, a shopping center. They're prerequisites to buying a home. And likewise, armies couldn't sustain a presence very long anywhere without water, rail, and road. So where those three intersect, there's a high probability that armies are going to run into each other at those places. Gettysburg was not fully operational for the Union Army. They had water and they had roads, good roads, multiple good roads. We all know that. But they lacked rail because the Confederates tore out a lot of rail. And so we invert that part of the discussion to talk about how the Confederates didn't have locomotives, so they ripped out rail so the Union wouldn't be able to take advantage of the rail. And it sort of leveled the playing field. Now, as we go along with the slides here, you're going to start to see some slides you recognize. For the book, two different people did the majority of the maps, Hal Jesperson and Phil Lano. So we're going to look at a mixture of both. And actually, Phil Lano adjusted the maps for the book. He even did a couple of adjustments to make them original to the book. I'm very grateful for that. But let's start out here looking at a map of the rail system. A lot of times we crop out everything around the battlefield outside of the hills, Round Top, Cemetery Ridge, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and we don't notice just a few miles out beyond that is water, rail, and good roads, mountains, passes, and things like that, which would predict where armies would go. So if you look down in the lower bottom of your map, you can see Harper's Ferry. And we know that the Confederates crossed over the mountains in Virginia, and they had to protect three passes, Upperville, Aldie, and Middleburg. If you go further north, there's Crampton's Gap, Turner's Gap, Ravens Rock Gap, Fairfield Gap, Monterey Pass, Cashtown Pass. These are like, as we all know, like highway mediums, where a police officer sits behind a chain waiting to go in either direction on I-95. They're cut across points that allow you to, in the case of the Confederate Army, to pass from the Cumberland Valley and Shenandoah Valley west of the mountains. Through these passes, they could enter into the Susquehanna Valley. And we also know that the Confederates invaded Pennsylvania a month before harvest time, not by coincidence. According to damage claims that were filed. And then one secondary source that deals with this real well is Kent Brown's book, Lee's Retreat. And the estimates are that Lee stole around 20,000 sheep, 30,000 hogs, 20,000 cows, 10,000 horses, thousands of pounds of sugar and flour. And that's to cover for supply chain shortages in the South. There were three factors for supply chain shortages. One was obviously the naval blockade. The Union blocked Savannah, Charleston, Wilmington, Chesapeake Bay. And then with the fall of Vicksburg, the South, between Vicksburg and Fort Donelson, Fort Henry, the South was deliberately by the Union cut off from the Mississippi and from the Gulf of Mexico. The South had very little manufacturing. They traded cotton to France, Germany, England, and Russia in exchange for weapons, ammunition, morphine, locomotive parts. They got their rail from Pennsylvania. The planters in the South so doubled down on cotton that there was an early dust bowl in the South. They weren't rotating crops well. There had to be an augmenting of hay, rye, barley, and oats from Pennsylvania before the war, along with yeoman farmers in the South to produce a balanced diet, if you will. So the North knew that the South had little manufacturing, heavily dependent on trade, trading cotton for everything to fight the war. So the Northern economic plans, called the Anaconda Plan, cut off the South from the sea so that essentially they're starved out. The fall of Vicksburg cut the South off from Texas and much of the South's cattle and meat products. A bag of groceries in Richmond in 1861 was $6. That same bag of groceries in 1863, when the bread riots occurred in late March of 63, was $60. We would call that inflation today, and we would say there were supply chain shortages. All the battles being fought in the South were destroying the food, the orchards. The fences were being used as firewood from 2 years of war there. And then the Emancipation Proclamation led to a number of African Americans escaping into Union lines. Well, that took away the labor source behind the lines for the South. So all of those things combined to starvation levels. That's why the Southerners were in Pennsylvania. That was the primary reason, is to get food. And they followed, predictably, they followed the Blue Ridge Mountains. You know, we're doing history at a higher level when we look for patterns across time and space. Patterns tell us something deeper about human behavior. And Lee's 3 invasions, if you will, one of them clearly is just a raid, and that would be the Monocacy campaign. But Antietam, Gettysburg, and Monocacy, all of those invasions or raids followed the same route, the Blue Ridge Mountains. Antietam probably would have ended up at Gettysburg had movements not been arrested at South Mountain in September 14th of 62. Why did Lee take that same route over and over and over? Because he couldn't go directly at Washington via, let's say, Alexandria or Northern Virginia, because those are the deepest points of the Potomac, and he didn't have pontoon bridges. So he had to cross at Falling Waters. It's a lot lower. He could jerry-rig some warehouses, take them apart, string together some canoes and cross, and that he had to cross a shallow area. And that's the reason why Lee invaded 3 straight times west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Now, as he followed the mountains north, the South didn't have locomotives. They couldn't use the rail. You may know that at Antietam, in 12 hours, ammunition was transferred from Relay Station on September 17th, 1862, north along the Northern Central Line to Carlisle, and then started south again on the Cumberland Valley Rail Line. And by September 18th, McClellan was resupplied with ammunition. If Lee had wanted to give battle again on the 18th, the Union was already resupplied. And Lee was aware of that. So when he came into Pennsylvania in 63, he wanted to rip out all of that rail. He couldn't use it. He didn't have the locomotives to use it. So he wanted to create a level playing field, sort of reverse engineering, rip out the rail. So as you know, I'm talking to a very informed audience. Lee estimated to have ripped out 100 miles of rail. Not every single tie, but they would take out 4 ties, create a bonfire, and put the rail on that till it got hot, and twist it into Sherman neckties a year before Sherman thought of it, and then toss the rail down in the woods, and you'd create these potholes essentially where a train would go airborne in certain sections. Jeb Stuart followed the Northern Central Line, and he tore up rail from there all the way towards Hanover and Carlisle ultimately. You probably know White's Comanches came through Gettysburg with Early's troops, on June 26th, and they tore up the Hanover-Gettysburg line all the way to Hanover Junction. 24 miles of rail, 22 bridges were burned, many of those rail bridges. These are not anger management problems for the Southern Army. These are deconstruction attempts that was planned out months in advance so that the Union wouldn't be able to bring in emergency troops raised for the defense of the state. They wouldn't be able to bring in horses on flatbed cars. They wouldn't be able to bring in ammunition, weapons, medical equipment, nurses' corps, whatever the Union would want to bring in, or export wounded to base hospitals in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington. All of that rail was ripped out along with the telegraph to create kind of a blackout in this area. Like Hurricane Sandy created a blackout. Couldn't even get a good shower if you didn't have a generator. The South intentionally ripped out the modern transportation systems. So the Union would be reduced to horse and wagon like the Southerners were. So I want you to notice the rail lines. Typically Gettysburg is really no different than any other battle in that the armies followed rail, not only to be next to their supplies, but next to communications, either to rip out the communications or to the telegraph, for instance, to be able to use it and have communication as well as to have supplies. Plus a rail line, unlike a road, is straighter. If you follow it, it's going to take you from point A to point B on a map. So look at the rail here and how it surrounds Gettysburg. If Pickett's troops were tearing out rail just a couple of days before Pickett's charge, they were ripping out the Cumberland Valley rail line. So the Southerners were ripping out rails so troops from Harrisburg couldn't come down behind their lines via the Cumberland Valley line while the battle was going on. And so if you look at Longstreet's troops and A.P. Hill's troops, they're following the Cumberland Valley line. Early cuts across the hyphen there, that would be from west to east, and follows the Hanover-Gettysburg line and rips that out. Stuart's ripping out the northern central line. And then one other point, look down at the lower part of your map and you see the Baltimore and Ohio line was ripped out from Frederick all the way to Harper's Ferry. Now why would they do that? And some of you all know the battle real well, that General Hooker wanted to cross the mountains right along that rail line between Frederick and Harper's Ferry in the lower left-hand corner of your map, and cut off Lee's retreat. Sort of like coming up behind a dog and pulling his tail and he turns and bites. The idea, if you could come up behind Lee's lines in the Cumberland Shenandoah Valley, he would have to turn and come back to Virginia. Then you achieve your objective of getting the Southerners out of Pennsylvania. Meade had inquired about that. Warren told Meade that Hooker had been looking at that idea. Lee just took that option away by ripping the rail out. And people will say, well, where was Beverly Robertson? And Lee had cavalry, and where were they? And he could have used his cavalry better. You say that if you don't follow logistics, but if you follow logistics, the Confederate cavalry, not with Stuart, ripped out a lot of rail that kept Lee's retreat route and his avenue of approach back to Virginia safe. The reason Lee escaped Gettysburg is because he had ripped out all the rail. And the reason why Lee fought a 3-day battle, armies keep 3 days rations, and then they move all the excess wagons far from the battlefield, like the Union moved their wagons south, some of their wagons south of Union Mills. That's so that the extra wagons are not cluttering avenues of approach for moving troops and carrying messages and picking up wounded. So armies keep 3 days rations on them. And even though Lee probably lost the battle on the second day, he had to fight on the third day to make the Union Army use up its third day's rations. And so then when he began his retreat, late on July 3rd and then July 4th, he knew that it would take a couple of days for the Union to repair those rail lines or bring wagons all the way up from Union Mills. And that gave Lee a 48-hour start. And that's how he escaped. It's because he had planned ahead and ripped out the rail. So I want you to see how the rail brought the armies in close proximity. And we're going to move along here. And I want to reinforce that visually. A picture's worth 1,000 words. Notice how the roads all come together there. Notice how the rail wraps around it. You can see the water. Really, you can say that the Battle of Gettysburg was a tug of war between two waterways, and that would be the Susquehanna River to the north, and then to the south, the Potomac River. The water framed the operations for the armies. And a lot of that has to do with, I'll say more about water with the next slide, but I want you just to see visually, look at the roads, look at the rail, look at the passes. You know, the Cashtown Pass was used. Buford would have known where to find Lee's army by going to the Cashtown Pass, because it's the only pass that you saw in the previous slide. It's 8 miles long and straight. If you've got 6 horses and mules pulling 1,000 pounds of ammunition, they can't go up a hill. They need a level pass. And so the Cashtown Pass was a predictable place for Buford to find Lee. What I'm trying to show everybody here is that it's not the armies running into each other. It's very logical, the routes they took based on water, rail, and road. It's, in some ways, the book is an environmental history, an environmental agency. Humans, not humans, but rather the environment determines what humans can do. I may want to buy a house in Beverly Hills, but I have a limited bank account. Same with generals. They may want to go to Philadelphia, or they may want to march to Pittsburgh, but they have limitations on what they can do. Supplies and supply lines and overextending supply lines. They need water, they need rail and road. And as you look at this water map, you can see the Monocacy is like a trunk of a tree. And notice all the branches to the right. Let's go counterclockwise. You've got Little Pipe Creek on your right. We continue counterclockwise like climbing a ladder. Big Pipe Creek. Then Rock Creek, Marsh Creek, Middle Creek at Emmitsburg. That's where Reynolds was when the battle began. And then you work your way on down to Tom's Creek. So the creeks are branches of the Monocacy. You all know that the Monocacy begins at Gettysburg. 200 million years ago, geologists say 2 plates collided 17 miles west of Gettysburg, thrusting upward, creating the Blue Ridge Mountains. Mold formed on the mountains, and that became topsoil. And with the slamming of the 2 plates together, the ground folded. That's why McPherson Ridge, Seminary Ridge, Belmont Schoolhouse Ridge, all the different ridges, Cemetery Ridge, they all are folded like a Ripple's potato chip from the mountains all the way out east of Gettysburg. The reason it's rippled, it's like pushing together an 8x11 piece of paper and you have folds in it. So that's what the swells are. They're the result of a collision 200 million years ago. And with that collision, also the topsoil cracked. The shale sandstone cracked. That released lava beneath the surface that come up to fill the cracks, like mortar between brick. And then over time, the original sandstone eroded away, leaving the lava rock, which we call igneous rock. Water over millions of years got into the crevices of the rock, and through freezing and thawing expanded and contracted, leveraging the rock, breaking it, causing it to fall over and become Devil's Den, Devil's Playground, Devil's Kitchen, Little Round Top, Culp's Hill, Forbes Rock. All of that's volcanic rock that came up to fill the and repair the damage from the collision 200 million years ago. That collision 200 million years ago also ruptured water, and the water's been leaking ever since. It's called Natural Spring, Cataline Spring, Kadori Spring, Minchie Spring, Spangler Spring. The springs then flow into the runs. Weinbrenner Run, Lady Run, Willoughby Run, Pitzer Run, Stevens Run, Plum Run, Gwen Run. All of those runs are runoffs, like Bull Run. They're just runs, and then they flow into 2 creeks that frame the battlefield like a goalpost frames a well-kicked football. You've got the utility hookup for the Confederate hospitals at Marsh Creek, and parallel with that, and east of that is the Union hospitals running parallel along Rock Creek. And then the two come together 5 miles south of Big Round Top and become the Monocacy River. So because of that collision 200 million years ago, that's why the battle could take place at Gettysburg. That's, of course, natural history. So one of the things I look at in the book is why Gettysburg is one of the few battles in the Civil War that doesn't have an alternative water name. And so, for instance, you have Sharpsburg, which is Antietam Creek, and you have Manassas, which is Bull Run, Murfreesboro, which is Stones River. You have the 7 Days Battle, which is the Peninsula, and that's the James and the Chesapeake. And then Fort Henry, Donaldson, and Vicksburg are along the Mississippi. You have Shiloh, which is Pittsburgh Landing. All of these places have water alternative names. Chickamauga is a river. Armies were dependent on rivers. Gettysburg's one of the few battles that was not given an alternative water name. And I have a chapter where I give it a name, and it's the Battle of the Monocacy Rock Creek. If you were to get, the battle was almost the Battle of Big Pipe Creek. Well, that's the Monocacy. And so it's interesting how once the armies moved from the utility hookup of Big Pipe Creek to Rock Creek, they dropped the water name. There's no longer Pipe Creek, but why shouldn't it be Rock Creek? Well, I deal with that in a chapter on why the term Gettysburg became the only name for the battle. Unlike Manassas and Bull Run and Sharpsburg and Antietam Creek, Gettysburg got one name and not a water name or a rail name. Sometimes battles are named after rail, Trevelyan Station, for instance. East Cavalry Field is a term that was coined by John Batchelder based on Middle Ages layout of land and plots of land. No one during the battle called it East Cavalry Field. They would have called it Golden Station because there was a rail connection there. And they were repairing rail in New Oxford. So they were operating along rail, not anything to do with a medieval plot of land called East Cavalry Field or South Cavalry Field. Those are post-war terms that veterans wouldn't have recognized during the battle. So once you start to look at the environment, the man-made environment, which is rail and roads, along with the natural environment of water and mountains and passes, they all crisscross at Gettysburg. So the Union Army, if somebody told me, look, I got 5 to 10 seconds, I'm visiting the park and I've got to go to dinner or something. Can you give me one quick answer in 5 to 7 seconds why the armies met at Gettysburg? My answer is water. The Union Army predictably followed the Monocacy north from the Potomac, and the South predictably followed the Antietam to the Conococheague north and to the Conewago, and the water connects at Gettysburg. Both the Susquehanna and the Monocacy start in Adams County. So water was going to lead them there. Now, why would water lead them there? I estimate in the book around 40,000 pails of water were used during the 3-day battle just to sponge the artillery between rounds. Armies were as dependent on water then as they are today as dependent as they are today. Do we still have a connection? I hope we do. And
yes, you're good. You're
okay.
good.
Okay, great. Water was as necessary then to armies then as today petroleum is to armies. So you have 40,000 pails of water used during the 3 days of the battle just to sponge artillery. The Union Army, by conservative estimates, had over 30,000 horses and mules at Gettysburg just pulling wheeled vehicles. And that would be ambulances, something like 18,000 horses and mules just pulling 3,000 ambulances. And you have ammunition, you have artillery pieces, you have axe, shovels, pots, pans, tents, hay, rye, barley, oats. You got miles and miles of wagons, and those horses drink 12 to 15 gallons of water a day. So you have to follow routes. The reason why Route 15 runs along the Monocacy is originally it was used as a trade route from South Central Pennsylvania to participate in the Chesapeake Bay's transatlantic trade in the early 1800s. So the armies are just following a route, just like you wouldn't drive a car along a route where you couldn't gas up every 300 miles or go to a charging station. Armies are, we're not even counting the cavalry. They're following water routes. And so it's the armies were named after water. Army of Potomac, James, Cumberland, Ohio, Tennessee. They were the armies just depended on water. In those days, the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution was about steam. So you have to have water for steam trains, water for the horses. There are 175,000 humans at Gettysburg. They drink up to a gallon of water a day. So it's predictable where the armies were going to meet just based on following the water routes. They were going to come together in the Gettysburg area. So the alternative water name would be the Monocacy Rock Creek. And then this is just moreover, I wanted you to see the nature and second nature. Nature is what is natural, and second nature is how humans shape nature. And the two together, you have second nature is rail and the roads, and then first nature is the mountains. But everything comes together at Gettysburg. And the battle is being fought between two lines of waterways, essentially. And that's our next slide. Now, in the book, I have a quote from General Meade's son, Captain Meade, where he said that the battle was fought between Rock Creek and Marsh Creek. And he said it was like a parallelogram, and it framed the battlefield. And if you carry that out, and I do this with the first day of the battle, take a look at where Buford set up his defense. Initially, he had Marcellus Jones. We might say, well, it's out at the Whistler House, or we might say Old Gam Printing. But where is he really? He's really overlooking Marsh Creek. Why would the 8th Illinois be out near Marsh Creek? Well, a horse drinks 12 to 15 gallons of water a day. If you got 1,600 cavalry, they have to find water. That's a prerequisite for even thinking about having a battle. So Buford, Devon, and Gamble, they set up along Marsh Creek to the west, and they set up along Rock Creek. Barlow's Knoll essentially is on Rock Creek. That's why it's important. And Rock Creek runs north all the way to near Hunterstown. So look out on your right, the Rock Creek line there. Really, the Battle of Gettysburg shouldn't be the fish hook. It should be the Rock Creek line, just like Antietam Creek and Bull Run. If we start to pay attention to the environment, it starts to have agency over what happens. When Cemetery Ridge was chosen and Cemetery Hill as a key position, one of the primary reasons is it's within 3 to 5 miles of the closest contact to where the creek is. And because that's where your hospitals are. You don't want the hospitals too close to the front lines because incoming fire will flush them out and damage them. You don't want your hospitals too close to the front, too far from the front lines, let's say 10 miles away, because the wounded might not make it that long with primitive transportation. So happy ground is about 3 to 5 miles. And so Cemetery Ridge is chosen. It's not the only reason, but one of the reasons it's chosen as the key position, Cemetery Ridge and Hill, is its proximity to water. Had Cemetery Ridge and Hill been another 2 miles west, they wouldn't have been the key positions because they would have been out of proper balance and distance with Rock Creek. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the two. Now, the roads, we need to say this about Cemetery Hill. Why is Cemetery Hill the key position on the battlefield? Because it's the hill, like a Gordian knot, that ties together the 3 roads the Union Army were controlling here at Gettysburg. Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, Little Round Top are not important in and of themselves. There are thousands of hills that replicate those hills all through South Central Pennsylvania. They're only important as they relate to interlocking with water, rail, and road and protecting them. So why is Cemetery Hill the key position? Why does Lee throw 13,000 troops right at Cemetery Hill desperately on the third day? It was his last attempt to take the Gordian knot that tied the three roads together the Union Army primarily used, the Baltimore Pike, Taneytown Road, and the Emmitsburg Road. And that ties into the broader concept. Your goal in war, politics, and even in ball games is divide and conquer. Regardless of the specificity of a strategy, it's divide and conquer. So, for instance, you remember shock and awe in 2003. We watched on 24-hour news channels streams of light coming out of the sky in the dark, bombing Baghdad. It was like a fireworks show. They called it shock and awe. Well, they weren't just randomly dropping bombs. They were dividing and conquering. The Air Force was taking out communications. They were taking out the internet, cell phone towers, television, and radio. So the next day, when it was clear in daylight, those planes flew over Baghdad and dropped tens of thousands of leaflets. People in the apartments in Baghdad came out and read the leaflets as they descended from the sky and picked them up off the ground and read them. And the leaflet said, your government and your leaders have surrendered, and you need to do so as well. Well, the government hadn't surrendered, but they were divided from the people by the communication systems knocked out. There was no radio, television, internet, and there was no way for the government to say, no, wait, we haven't surrendered. So thousands of people in Baghdad surrendered through disinformation. That's called divide and conquer. And if you want to look at D-Day, you think, well, why were thousands of paratroopers dropped in obscure areas? That's divide. You divide, you try to send your enemy in different directions, and then it isolates the point that you want to attack. If you divide first, if you divide your enemy first, then you can attack part and parcel with a 2-to-1 advantage and defeat your enemy in detail, but you have to divide first. So if the Confederates took Cemetery Hill, the Union is retreating on the Emmitsburg Road, the Taneytown Road, and the Baltimore Pike. Look at those three roads on the map. You'll notice those three roads get wider and wider apart on a retreat in the direction of Maryland. Like bicycle spokes get progressively wider heading towards the outer rim. That would mean that the Union Army would be divided in three parts. And the Confederates could take a 2-to-1 advantage and overwhelm 1/3 of the Union Army at a time on each individual road. Or even one of those roads, you could eliminate 1/3 of the Union Army by attacking with 2/3. That's called defeating in detail. That comes from dividing, and then you conquer in part and parcel. And so when Lee came to Gettysburg, he used the roads of Gettysburg to disperse his army, to gather supplies. He had wagons the size of school buses, yellow school buses, that went in 4 directions of the compass from Gettysburg. Gathered all these grains, 750,000 pounds daily ration of hay and oats to feed the 100,000 livestock that he stole for the next 4 months. He was doing some serious grocery shopping, but Gettysburg was his place to quickly concentrate his army, because you don't want to be divided when you come within 40 miles contact of your enemy. And Lee learned through a spy that the Union Army was only 38 miles from his army on June 28th. And that's why he quickly told everyone that was spread out from York to Carlisle to Fayetteville to converge on Gettysburg, but with the caveat, if the Union Army won the race to the crossroads, then the Confederates couldn't unify at Gettysburg. So that's why the contingency was, if the Union Army wins the race to the crossroads, bypass Gettysburg, and form its defensive front in front of the mountains, where all the supplies, the 100,000 livestock and 30 miles worth of supply trains can escape through the mountains, through the Cashtown Pass, through the Fairfield Pass, and get along what is today roughly Route 81 and 11 and go back through Maryland south into Virginia. The roads then are crucial to dispersing and then converging. And so that's why there was this race to the crossroads. And we call that second nature. That's human nature. All right, we'll move it along here. And you just see the importance of water, rail, and road all throughout. This is just a minor point, but Hal just Pearson did this map for me. That it's an important point, though, that the idea of a fish hook is a post-war term. No one uttered that term that we know of during the battle. The West Pointers would have used the term concentric lines, interior lines, salient. Dennis Hartman wrote an article, and I quoted in the book. He wrote an article in 1866, and he taught logistics and tactics at West Point. And he wrote an article in 1866 entitled "The Salient at Gettysburg." And basically, the salient is Cemetery Hill and how that and its extensions and its extremities protect the roads. But you can see that actually the right flank of the Union line is not Culp's Hill. It's well below that. It's Powers Hill. It's McAllister Hill. There are troops on Wolf Hill at different times. And all the way down to Wolf Walk Ridge, where the Sunoco station is that overlooks Sheets and the mall. There were movements there by the 12th Corps for 2 days. All right. And then what I want you to see is, and this is an emphasis in the book, is that what General Meade really wanted to do, his real plan at Gettysburg, was to unbend the fish hook and straighten it, like you would take a paper clip and unbend it and make it straight. Meade was never comfortable with the fish hook because that's a defensive position. He wanted to extend, he told Slocum on the evening of July 1st in a letter. Slocum suggested it, and Meade wrote back that if the Fifth Corps is up in the morning, we'll extend the line. Extend means unbend it and run it from Culp's Hill up through Benner's Hill, all the way in the direction of Barlow's Knoll and then north of that. That's the Rock Creek line. Meade wants to establish a Rock Creek line. Taking Benner's Hill becomes really important to General Meade. The precedent is set on the evening of July 1st, when Williams' division, 1st Division, 12th Corps marches out to Benner's Hill, skirmishes with some of Ewell's troops, contributes to Ewell not attacking Cemetery Hill by creating the impression the entire 12th Corps is there. Only half the 12th Corps was there. The other half, Geary's division, was taken by Hancock and moved over on the left. But presumably the entire 12th Corps was to go to the right. That never happened. But then there was news reached General Ewell late in the evening that the 5th Corps was also on the Hanover Road. So he had 12th and 5th Corps on his right. That would be his left, our right. And that was all he needed not to attack Cemetery Hill. But the 12th Corps contributed greatly to him not attacking Cemetery Hill. You couldn't be sure how many red stars there were there that day. And Ewell talks about in his report seeing Williams out there and watching the 49th Virginia skirmish with him. But Jenkins replaced Gordon at Barlow's Knoll, and Gordon went over with Extra Billy Smith or Governor Smith to support the skirmishing going on with the 49th Virginia. And that was going on between them and the 13th New Jersey, 2nd Mass, 27th Indiana, and 107th New York. That skirmishing was really crucial to Ewell pumping the brakes at the end of the first day of the battle. All right, so Slocum says to Meade, he said, if the 5th Corps is up tomorrow, all the way up, he said, we can extend the line, that is, unbend the line and run it north. And here's another map Hal Pearson did showing the route that the 12th Corps took towards Benner's Hill on the first day. Not a lot of people know about that movement, but it set a very important precedent for me. Notice at the top of your screen, York Pike, Gettysburg, Hanover Railroad. As long as the Confederates were east of Gettysburg, the Union couldn't finish repairing the rail lines. And that's crucial to know. And so let me go ahead and overstate it a little bit just to for emphasis. The logistical reason why Ewell kept troops east of Gettysburg and why that was extended with Stuart's cavalry on the third day, the logistical reason, not the tactical reason. The tactical reason is a pincer on Cemetery Hill, but the logistical reason, the logistical reason why Ewell kept Early and Johnson east of Gettysburg was to picket that scab, that is the rail line that the 35th Virginia Battalion, Whites Comanches, along with Early, had torn out on June 26th to make sure that rail line wasn't repaired. And I talk about this in the book. If you go in the ORs, volume 27, part 3 correspondences, you can track hour by hour how the railroad engineers are trying to repair the rail line from Hanover Junction all the way to Gettysburg so that they can bring in emergency troops, so that they can bring in extra horses, ammunition, they can bring in medical supplies. Eventually, Lincoln is brought in on that rail line. But this is really, really important. The rail line determines why Ewell leaves Confederate troops east of Gettysburg. That's the logistical reason. And there are tactical reasons too. There's an old adage that amateurs study tactics, experts study logistics. That doesn't mean anybody here is an expert, but when you start to dabble with logistics, it defangs and demystifies things that previously didn't make sense. And here's a map in the book done by Hal Jesperson showing the fighting on what would eventually be called Hospital Hill. At the time of the battle, it would just be another Wolf Hill, named after George Wolfe. But you can see Williams' troops coming into proximity with Gordon and Smith. Gordon and Smith would have been pursuit forces for Early at the end of the first day. Their attention is diverted by the 12th Corps to protect the flank, Confederate left flank. I want you to notice too in this Hal Jesperson map, the 5th Corps coming in on the Hanover Road. Now, why did they come in on the Hanover Road? Why did they take the wide arcing route? Why didn't they follow the Baltimore Pike or Taneytown Road, Emmitsburg Road like the majority of the Army did? It's because they were sweeping from the east to make sure that there were no residuals of Confederates east of Gettysburg that could interfere with the rail line repair that Meade was trying to organize through Harman Halt to make connections with the outside world. This is a map Phil Lano did showing General Meade's offensive plan on the morning of the 2nd. Now, Meade said at 9:30 a.m., this is in ORs, and then he reiterated this in his congressional hearings the following March of 64. Meade said that he told Slocum, remember they had the correspondence the night before about, hey, if the 5th Corps is up, we can extend the line. That's just like unbending a paperclip and straightening it along north-south along the Rock Creek line. There would be no fishhook. There would just be a line, a Union battle line parallel with Rock Creek. And so the next morning, Meade is operating the morning of the 2nd under that idea that they can make an attack, remove Confederate threat to east of Gettysburg, to his logistics. So at 9:30 a.m., Meade sent a message to Slocum, and it said, I want you to look into the practicability of making an attack with parts of the 5th and 12th Corps so soon as the 6th Corps learned to be within supporting distance. Now, the 6th Corps was marching north from Manchester. We know they marched 32 miles in a day. It's not really clear why, but when they got to the vicinity of the Maryland-Pennsylvania border, they turned west towards the Taneytown Road. Some have speculated that it was because they thought maybe Meade was still at Taneytown. Others have said they were going over to the Union left, because there's a map done by William Payne showing the 6th Corps sketched into the defenses with the 3rd Corps. And that map developed between 4 a.m. in the morning and 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And in the evolutionary evolvement of that map, Meade's cartographer, William Payne, the 6th Corps shown on the left For whatever reason, the 6th Corps took a by road going west towards Taneytown Road off the Baltimore Pike, and then decided that that was not correct, and they about faced their own countermarch, if you will, and they marched back to the Baltimore Pike and fell in behind wagon trains, and it slowed their arrival. The 6th Corps would have been up much earlier in the day. The heads of their column reached Gettysburg around 2 p.m. The rear of their columns around 8 p.m. They would have gotten there before noon in time for this attack from Meade had they not taken this mysterious reasoned turn towards the Taneytown Road. So Meade at 9:30 said, I want you to look into the practicability, he told Slocum, of making this attack. Practicable means if it's practicable means is it practical and are you capable of doing it? So then at 10 o'clock, Meade said in his testimony to Congress at 10 a.m., he sent a premonitory order. That means it's not an if practicable. This is just the order and you have to follow it. And there's no wiggle room at that point. And the order read, I want you to take the Corps of the 5th and 12th Corps, and I want you to attack, and I want this to be decisive. That's a key military word. It means bring the battle to a decision, to end the battle. And Slocum responded to the first memorandum, the first one that said, if practicable. If you read the ORs, Meade received it. Someone writes up in the corner, maybe it's Seth Williams, received at 11 a.m. Slocum never responded to the premonitory order. He responded to the if practicable order, and he said, it's not practicable. I can't make the attack you want to make. He said, the ground is not of much use to the enemy, and he said, I can't detach enough troops to make the attack. What he means is Wolf Hill is such a huge mass that maneuvering east of Gettysburg, east of Wolf Hill, means you're operating on an island. Wolf Hill prevents the rest of the Union Army from being able to easily support you. He said, I can't detach enough troops out there to be able to make this decisive attack. And besides, it doesn't give the enemy any particular peculiar advantage. Some of you know, within a month and a half, Slocum was out of Meade's army, and he was eventually in Sherman's March to the Sea, but he never returned. It's never stated why his corps and the 11th Corps left, but it may very well have been related to that moment. He directly disobeyed that order. Now you say, well, why is that important? You know, I had a professor that used to say this to me, Troy, you need to know a little of the road not taken to better understand the road that is taken. Let's visit that for just a moment. If the 5th and 12th Corps attack, they outnumber at least 2 to 1, probably closer to 3 to 1 advantage Johnson's troops on Benner's Hill. So there's a probability they're successful. If they take the hill, watch what happens here now. And I'll just say this to yourself. Does the fighting at Culp's Hill ever happen? Does the fighting at East Cemetery Hill ever happen? If this attack that's to be decisive is followed through by Slocum, does East Cavalry Field ever happen? Does Brinkerhoff Ridge ever happen? And the answer, of course, is no, because if the attack happens and is successful, all Confederate presence east of Gettysburg is eliminated. The rail lines can be repaired, supplies can be brought in. By making the attack on Benner's Hill by itself means nothing, but you take the Hanover Road and you take the York Road. See, by the third day of the battle, the Confederates controlled 8 roads. The Union only they lost the Emmitsburg Road with the Peach Orchard fight. So they only had Taneytown Road and Baltimore Pike. That's a disaster. Try to imagine exiting an arena where there's 80,000 people. Which arena would you want to exit? One with 2 exits or one with 8 exits? So the Confederates had essentially taken away and restricted all Union movements down to 2 roads. And that's Meade can reverse all of that in one fell swoop with this decisive attack north of town. That puts a big buffer between where the Confederates are, who would be forced back to Oak Ridge, between them and all of Meade's supply trains on the Baltimore Pike. The reason Pat Green had to throw up field fortifications is to create a tortoiseshell protection of all the wagon trains on the Baltimore Pike. You got over 30,000 horses and mules there parked with miles of wagons. And all of that's vulnerable if you allow the Confederates creepage east of Gettysburg. You can eliminate that in one fell swoop. And now let me really throw you back on your heels if you think about this. Would the attack at the wheat field, Devil's Den, Little Round Top, and the peach orchard ever have occurred had Slocum followed those orders? And the answer is no, because Richard Anderson's division, Comte de Paris says this, and I quote it in the book, that Comte de Paris in his book, Gettysburg, said that Lee only had one fresh division to support Johnson if Johnson was attacked. And that was Richard Anderson. So if Johnson's attack, his only support to avoid being eliminated is to bring Richard Anderson over. So Lee would have had to send Richard Anderson. Well, where's Anderson? Anderson's facing Cemetery Ridge and Hill. Longstreet can't make an attack up the Emmitsburg Road. He can't he can't make an attack up the Emmitsburg Road towards Anderson's division, critical mass towards Cemetery Hill, without Anderson there. So that one attack, I think it's the biggest missed moment of the Civil War, that Slocum directly disobeyed that order. And all the fighting would have looked very different. I don't know that the Confederates would have had any other options except to leave through the Cashtown Pass had the attack happened and been successful. So Meade wants badly to straighten his line. And here's a Phil Lano version of the same attack. The attack wouldn't have been off of Culp's Hill. The staging area for the attack for 5th Corps would have been along the Hanover Road and the area where C.E. Williams is today. That's where the attack would have been. That's where Williams was the day before. It's where the 16th Pennsylvania Cavalry would guard the pass on July 3rd and have vedettes connected between Lost Avenue all the way out to Hoffman Road, connecting the Union right flank infantry at Lost Avenue or Neal Avenue with Custer and Gregg on the 3rd day near Hoffman Road and East Cavalry Field, which should probably be called the Battle of Golden Station. Here's a picture of Herman Haupt. I deal with this in the book about how Meade, as early as June 30th, was exploring the idea of repairing the rail lines to Gettysburg so he would be fully operational, water, rail, and road. As long as he didn't have rail, he was only partly operational. It's like you having water and septic in your house, but not electricity. Well, you're not fully operational. So Meade's worried that the rail line, as late as 2 p.m. on July 2nd, Meade received a message from Herman Haupt saying, I can't make a link, reconnect the Hanover-Gettysburg line to Gettysburg and connect it with the outside world, Carlisle, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, Washington, Baltimore, to get your wounded out, to bring ammunition in. I can't do any of that until you remove the enemy east of Gettysburg. That was the whole point of Meade's plan. And by the way, a decisive attack means bring the battle to a decision. It also important to mention that Meade never gave a premonitory order the remainder of the battle for a decisive attack. There was a vote at Falling Waters, but not a no wiggle room, no latitude decisive order given. And one of the fascinating things, I got a chance to speak at Temple University in April, and I was talking to the chair of the history department. And I said, you know what, ask your students, if any of them are looking for research project, where there really could be some really good research is to know the identities of the 200 African Americans and the 200 Irishmen that rebuilt the rail lines, specifically the Hanover-Gettysburg line. They put down one tie for every 4. You all know that. And then the line was partly open by July 5th. It was fully operational by July 10th. That's the reason Hospital Hill processed 20,000 wounded. That's where the rail line is. That was the position that Meade wanted to take on July 2nd. Hospital Hill is, you say, oh, it's the second largest field hospital in North America, second only to Chimborazo. Well, why? It's because it was the Union line straightened north to be able to bring the rail lines into repair behind Union lines. and it was immediately turned into a major logistical area. It would have been that had Slocum made the attack, it would have been that much earlier. It's the same train that eventually brought Lincoln. People ask about what role did African Americans play? African Americans rebuilt those rail lines. They participated in that. They also built field fortifications around Harrisburg. And when we widen our scope beyond just the battle, if we crop out everything, crop out the water, and we just look at the hills, we're missing so much. If we look at water, rail, and road and expand out, we can see the African American contribution is quite significant in the way of logistics. We start focusing on logistics, they come into clear focus. And now we can see a map that was done by Hal Spears, and we're getting near the end here and I'm about to wrap it up here, but you can see the artillery that the Union set up along the Baltimore Pike. There's Wainwright's guns on East Cemetery Hill. And if you go south, look for continuity now. There's Heckman's guns in front of Henry Spengler House. Further south, you have Weingar, Knapp, Rigby, and one or two guns under Weingar between Powers Hill and McAllister Hill. And then I don't even have this mentioned in here, but Hexamer, whose New Jersey guns are commemorated in front of the Pennsylvania Memorial, they were also on the second day along the Baltimore Pike. So you're looking at somewhere between 44 to 48 artillery pieces along the Baltimore Pike. Why were they there? They were there as a safety precaution because Slocum didn't make the attack. Thank goodness, Pap Green threw up field fortifications. He knew that Confederates were only a hair's breadth away from the wagon trains. You get to the wagon trains, you shoot one horse, the wounded horse, the other 5 horses won't work in unison with him. You got a stranded wagon. Then you come in with torches, set fire. It's a disaster. So Culp's Hill is, thanks to Pap Green, is built into this strong field fortification. When Pap Green learns that the attack that Slocum is asked to make or told to make is not going to happen, that means you're going to have to meet your enemy within a few hundred yards of the Baltimore Pike. So you throw up field fortifications, and what do? You line the Baltimore Pike with 44 to 48 guns to cover the wagons if disaster occurs at Culp's Hill. Then I want you to see this map done by Hal Spearson showing the Monocacy River. We should never forget that this is the Battle of the Monocacy Rock Creek, just like there was almost a battle at the Monocacy Big Pipe Creek. Nothing's different, really. Reynolds, when his troops were near the battlefield on July 1st, they were at Middle Creek. I remember when John Fuss took me for the day down, he knew I was writing this book on Rock Creek and he was fascinated. And he said, well, let me show you Middle Creek where I grew up. And he took me for the day down there, introduced me to all of his neighbors, and I got dinner down there. And we spent the day at Middle Creek. And Reynolds originally was on defense at Middle Creek, not really Taneytown, Middle Creek. If we start looking at the geography and the environment, we start to tell the story a little different. But I want you to see all of that water and the importance of see the vedettes, the Federal Cavalry vedettes. They go all the way down to Route 140 south and all the way up to Taneytown Road north. That's a much wider expanse than we normally think of the battlefield. But when we crop the battlefield down to just a few hills, we miss out on what's going out on the periphery logistically. And then this is the map that was submitted in 1895 for the enabling legislation. It's a literal blueprint, the enabling legislation signed by the veterans for what the battlefield should look like. You and I do daily tours today in the political boundaries. That's what Congress has authorized, the 1991-92 boundaries that has been adjusted a couple of times. The veterans operated on conceptual boundaries. That is a much wider scope. They couldn't envision airplanes, the veterans couldn't envision Tanger outlets and Targets and Walmarts being built near the battlefield and parking lots filled with lights. They couldn't visualize anything but it always being agriculture. And the federal government wasn't large immediately after the Civil War anyway, so buying up 6,000 acres was not possible, nor was it necessary, because no one could visualize the modern development, homes and everything we have now that challenge battlefields. But notice the original conceptual maps before some of this land was erased. Look at number 7 down in the lower right-hand corner. That's Wolf Hill. Are you saying that Troy, that the veterans wanted to preserve Wolf Hill? Well, there it is, right there in the enabling legislation. Well, look at 6 up in the upper right corner. That's Hospital Hill. That's Meade's objective after 7 p.m. on July 1st. And by the way, he takes it. What happens after Pickett's charge within a few hours? Johnson's division leaves Benner's Hill, pulls back to Oak Ridge. That's what Meade wanted all along. What does the 12th Corps do on July 4th, after a few hours after Pickett's charge? They march out to Benner's Hill and claim it. What does the 11th Corps do? They step off Cemetery Hill and they go to what is now Howard Avenue in Colt Park Development. What's that doing? That's taking the paperclip and straightening it out. It's not theory. It actually happened. That's what Meade wanted to do. Pickett's charge didn't win the battle. The Union Army just absorbed the Confederate last attack. The Union Army didn't win until they went on the offensive. Offensive is when they unfolded their line and straightened it along Rock Creek. And Lee had nowhere to go at that point except to funnel back through the Cashtown Pass and head south with his supplies. And by the way, after the Union line uncoils on July 3rd and into July 4th, and unbends and straightens and extends the way Slocum and Meade had talked about it on July 1st. Once that finally happens after Pickett's charge, once that happens, the Union Army never again, the remainder of the war was on the defense. Every successful war has an offensive phase. Think of Fallujah in Iraq and General Petraeus. Think of Grant in the last year of the war. I mean, the South is not just going to give up. You have to go after them. And that's what Grant did the last year of the war. Look at Eisenhower. It's not enough to just win a defensive battle. He had to push Hitler all the way to Berlin. There has to be an offensive phase. That's what Grant did. That's what Sherman did. But it really is triggered when the Union Army comes down off of Culp's Hill and extends the line north. That's when the battle is won. It's when the Union Army goes from defense to offense, and that happens when the fishhook uncoils. So there's a lot more we can say, but that's all roads led to Gettysburg. It's a privilege being able to share it with you this evening. Thank you.
Excellent, Troy. Give me a second here while I turn on everybody's video. Wow. Now I got to finish. Well, it's a rainy day tomorrow. I'm going to finish that book.
Thank you, Fran.
There you go. So hang on here a second. Catch your breath. Wait till I get everybody's mics turned on again here. Host told unmute themselves. Take a breather. Laura Elliott's on. Laura is going to be our speaker starting the 12th of September. Lauren, while Troy gets a breath, you want to tell us a little bit about what you're going to talk about the second Thursday in September?
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate the invitation to be here and share this research with the Gettysburg National Military Park Licensed Battlefield Guides and Friends starting on September 12th, or on September 12th, not starting. We'll actually finish the same day we start, so you guys won't have to spend multiple days. It's kind of interesting listening to Mr. Harman's presentation. Is really a macro view, a bird's eye view of the entire battlefield. And what we're going to talk about on September 12th is a very small, tiny micro section of the battlefield. And going along with what Mr. Harman named the different potential battles, this one would be the Battle of Warfield Ridge. So we're going to talk about Warfield Ridge and actually the Warfield House and what happened there. I'm just going to give you a little teaser so that you'll kind of understand what the premise of the talk is. About 10 years ago, I stumbled on a speech delivered by Lafayette McLaws to the Confederate veterans in Savannah. And McLaws said this: one company numbering 37 had, by the bursting of a shell in its front as it went into the charge, lost 30 men, 6 killed, leaving but 7 unhurt. I remember reading that and thinking, wow, that's a lot of casualties from a single shell. But McLaws didn't say what regiment was impacted or even what brigade that regiment was part of. So it just kind of went to the back of my head and kind of stayed there. It was kind of stuck in my head. And about 7 years later, a friend of mine, you guys might know Tom Elmore. He's sort of a Gettysburg statistician. He likes to keep up with statistics about the Battle of Gettysburg. And I was talking to him, and he said, you know, I've made this list of the most destructive artillery impacts of the Battle of Gettysburg. And he showed it to me. And I thought, well, that one that McLaws mentions not on your list, and it's certainly not at the top, which it would have been had it been on his list. And he said that he assumed that most historians thought that McLaws' statement was apocryphal. And I thought, apocryphal, wow, okay, well, but I really can't imagine McLaws saying something like that if it wasn't true. So basically that discovering that account pretty much is what started the research project, and it turned into a very long one and an involved one that lasted for a length of time. I still work full time, and so not able to work on research all the time. So, but what I discovered is that the actual impact that occurred that McLaws was referring to actually did happen. And that even though he said there were 30 casualties from that single shell, there's 29 that I've documented. In other words, when I say documented, I mean I know their names and who they were and, you know, all the details about them. Now there may have been 30, but I've only documented 29. But
Well,
when you think of,
we'll look forward to hearing that.
yeah, well, I'm looking forward to presenting it, and it happened right there in the yard of the Warfield House. So all you licensed battlefield guides will be interested to hear about what happened there.
Very good. All right, Troy, back to you. Folks, if you have questions, you can raise your hand if you know how to do it. Every time I turn on Zoom, they do something different. Troy, I always teach that the fishhook line only existed for a few hours, and it becomes a horseshoe line. And I do like that. Explains a lot to me when you back it up over the hill there and do that. So I appreciate that. It's really, really good. So who has questions for Troy? Go ahead. You can raise your hand and unmute and ask. Wow. Well, guys, the book is available at the visitor center, and I bet you can get it on Amazon, right, Troy?
Yes.
Yeah. And I do know if you put it in a paper bag and ask him to sign it and let it at the desk, somehow it gets signed. Troy, how long does it take you to come up with all this research? Like, how many years of work are we looking at this here?
The writing was just a couple of years, but the gathering of the information was much longer. It's like yourself when you work there. You know, Confucius said thousands of years ago, "I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand."
Yeah.
And I think that's why visitors like the guided walks and the guided talks, is because we're not only bringing in the visual, but the hearing and the kinetics of movement. And we're not being fired upon, but we're in a sense doing it. We're walking the ground. And I think you can attest to this as a guide, is when you're around it every day and you're walking it, it's almost like retracing the steps, not the scene of a crime, but sort of like a detective story. And the ground reveals its secrets. And then you get this thought process, and then you start talking to people. And I think it's the place is so inspirational.
Yeah. And the connections, when I have people who've like said they know all about it, when you show them Powers Hill just to watch their eyes glass over and say, and behind me is Wolf's Hill. And you start talking about there's more than just 4 hills here. There's a ton of hills.
Mm-hmm.
Roads, but I am now going to politely steal from you in your book and put the
Mhm.
railroad story in too, because with the medical care, I always tell people, HALP is responsible for keeping the casualties as low as possible. You know, that guy and his work crews were amazing, and when they weren't repairing railroads, they were making sections of it outside of Washington City. He was actually ahead of the army coming north. It's those stories that get there. It's like William Oates said, I'm always surprised how sometimes the greatest events turn on small little details, like the ability to do that. Last call for questions. All right, man. I saw 47 here tonight, Troy. So thank you very much, guys. Well done. We'll see you again when the video comes out. Troy, I always will give you a copy of it, and it's yours. We don't publish it. If you want me to send it to somebody or something, I will do that. But well done. Great job.
Thank you so much, Fran,
Yeah,
everybody.
several people have written on the comments. They said they just ordered the book, and it's also available on Audible.
Oh, there you go. Good. Very good. All right, Laura, we'll see you in September. Thank you, everybody. Stay dry.
Cheers.
Good night.
Everybody, thanks,
Sure,
Troy.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Troy.